The morning Irene Grady walked into the feed store with nothing but a worn coin purse and a look of quiet desperation on her face, John Rhodes felt his heart break clean in two, and he had been waiting a long time for it to do exactly that. It was the spring of 1873, deep in the sun-scorched territory of New Mexico, in the small but stubborn town of Redrock Crossing, a place that sat at the intersection of two cattle trails and survived on the stubbornness of the people who refused to leave it. The land was beautiful the way a rattlesnake was beautiful, all color and danger and a kind of wild grace that could kill you if you weren't paying attention. Red rock bluffs rose in the distance like cathedral walls, and the sky above them was so blue it made your chest ache if you stared too long. Irene had come to Redrock Crossing 8 months before with her father, Daniel Grady, who had believed, with the particular optimism of a man who had never successfully farmed anything in his life, that New Mexico would be different. That the dry soil and the blazing sun and the occasional Apache raid would somehow yield the wheat and corn and prosperity that Missouri had denied him for 2 decades. He had built a small homestead 4 miles east of town, had planted his seeds with calloused and hopeful hands, and had died of a fever before the first green shoots ever broke through the earth. That had been 6 weeks ago, and those 6 weeks had taught Irene things about loneliness and hunger that she had never wanted to know. She was 22 years old, with dark brown hair that the sun had threaded with copper, and green eyes that had not softened despite everything they had seen. She was not a small woman. She was tall for her time and carried herself like she expected the world to argue with her, but she had grown thin in the weeks since her father's passing, and the hollows beneath her cheekbones told a story that her straight spine was trying hard to contradict. John Rhodes had been watching her for all 8 months she had been in Redrock Crossing, which he would have been deeply ashamed to admit if anyone had ever asked him directly. He was 28 years old, lean and brown from years of outdoor work, with dark eyes that most people found difficult to read and hands that were more useful than elegant. He ran a cattle operation 4 miles west of town with his foreman, an older Mexican man named Domingo Verla, and a crew of 3 ranch hands. It was not a grand operation by any measure, but it was solid and honest in his, which was more than most men in Redrock Crossing could say about their work. He had noticed Irene the day she arrived, standing in the back of her father's wagon with one hand shading her eyes as she looked over the town with an expression that was equal parts assessment and disappointment. He had been loading supplies into his wagon outside the feed store, and he had stopped what he was doing and simply watched her, because something about the set of her jaw and the intelligence in her eyes made him feel like he was seeing something important for the first time. He had not known what to do with that feeling, so he had done what he always did with feelings he could not manage. He had folded it up carefully and put it somewhere quiet and gone back to work. He had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times in the months that followed, pleasantries mostly, a nod in the general store, a brief exchange about the weather outside the church on the 2 Sundays she had attended before her father's death made church feel like a wound she could not afford to open. He knew her name because he had asked the postmaster, which was another thing he would never have admitted without significant legal compulsion. And now she was standing in the feed store with her worn coin purse, and Bert Calloway, who owned the feed store and had the soul of a man who kept meticulous accounts, was telling her in a not unkind but completely inflexible voice that the credit her father had established could not be extended further, and that he was sorry for her loss but business was business. John was standing at the back of the store, near the bulk grain bins, ostensibly reading a bill of sale that Domingo had given him that morning. In reality, he was listening to every word of the conversation at the front counter, and his chest was doing something complicated and painful. "I understand," Irene said, and her voice was steady in a way that John recognized as the kind of steady that costs a great deal to maintain. "But I have this." She placed the coin on the counter. It caught the light from the window, and John could see even from the back of the store that it was a single silver dollar. "And I can work. I can sew, I can cook, I can keep accounts. If anyone in town needs those things, I will do them in exchange for goods." Bert Calloway looked at the coin and looked at Irene and had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Mrs. Calloway does our sewing," he said, "and I keep my own accounts. I don't know who else might need." "I will think of something," Irene said, picking the coin back up with a composure that made John want to say something extremely impolite to Bert Calloway. She turned from the counter, and that was when she saw John standing in the back of the store. She stopped. He had not moved. He was still holding Domingo's bill of sale like a man who had been frozen in place by something he was not prepared to deal with. "Mr. Rhodes," she said. "Miss Grady," he said. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you," she said. She had said those two words so many times in the past 6 weeks that they had worn smooth as river stones, polished and flat and containing nothing now but the shape of the grief they once held. She moved toward the door. "Miss Grady," he said again, and he was not entirely sure what he was going to say next. He only knew that he could not watch her walk out that door with one silver dollar and a homestead that had a dead crop in the ground in winter, even a New Mexico winter, still a possibility on the far side of autumn. "Do you still have your father's land?" She turned again. "Yes. I have the homestead. The horse died in March. The mule is still alive. The crop did not," she paused. "The crop did not take. But you have the land and the structure." "Yes," she said, and there was a careful quality to the word, like she was not sure yet what he was building toward and did not want to put weight on it before she knew if it would hold. "I need someone to keep accounts for the ranch," John said. "Domingo is a fine foreman, but his reading and writing are limited, and I have been doing the books myself. It takes time I do not have to spare. I would pay in goods and a small cash wage. It would not make you wealthy, but it would keep the larder stocked." Irene looked at him for a long moment. The light from the door was behind her, so he could not fully read her expression, but he could see that she was thinking, which she did with her whole face in a way that he had always found extraordinary. "You are offering me work," she said. "I am," he said. "Out of generosity," she said, "or out of actual need." John was a man who valued honesty because he had seen the damage that its absence could do to a person and a place. But he was also a man standing in a feed store, trying not to make obvious the fact that he had been quietly, persistently, privately devoted to this woman for the better part of a year. So he split the difference. "Both," he said. "I do genuinely need the accounts kept. I also genuinely would prefer that you not go hungry." Something shifted in her face at that. A small softening like the first thaw of a long winter there and gone so quickly that he might have imagined it. "I will come by tomorrow morning," she said, "to see what the work involves. I am not accepting charity." "I know that," he said. "All right," she said. And she walked out of the feed store into the bright New Mexico morning. And John Rhodes stood in the back of Bert Calloway's establishment, holding a bill of sale that he had entirely forgotten. He was holding, and tried to remember how to breathe like a normal person. The ride back to his ranch that day was 4 miles of sun and dust and the smell of sage, and John spent most of it having a very serious internal conversation with himself about what he was doing and whether it was wise and whether it would hurt her if she ever figured out the full truth of it. He was not, by nature, a man who deceived people. But there was a difference, he told himself, between deception and simple silence. He needed someone to keep his books. That part was entirely true. The fact that he would have manufactured any reasonable excuse to put food on Irene Grady's table was merely additional information that she did not need. Domingo was at the corral when John rode in, and the old foreman had the particular stillness about him that meant he had been waiting to say something. "Well," Domingo said. "Well, what?" John said, swinging down from his horse. "You had that look when you rode out this morning. The look that means you are going to do something." "I offered Miss Grady work keeping the ranch accounts," John said, handing his horse's reins to the nearest hand and walking toward the house. Domingo was quiet for a moment, which for Domingo was approximately the same as a long speech. "That is a good thing," he said finally. "It is a practical arrangement," John said. "Yes," Domingo said, in the tone of a man who understood perfectly well that it was also several other things simultaneously. Irene arrived the next morning at 8:30, which told John something about her immediately. She was not the kind of person who made a man wait to see if she would actually show up. She came on the mule, which was old but sturdy, and she was wearing a practical dark dress and carrying a bag that contained, as she explained when she dismounted, her father's account ledger from the farm and a set of pens she had brought from Missouri. "I thought it would be helpful to understand how you prefer your records kept before I impose any system," she said, standing in the yard with the morning sun lighting up the copper in her hair while John tried very hard to look like a man conducting routine business. "That is sensible," he said. "Come in and I will show you what I have." The ranch house was modest but solid. John had built most of it himself over the past 4 years, and it had the clean lines of a place where a careful person lived. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a table near the window that John used as a desk when the weather was too harsh to work outside. He had laid out his ledgers and receipts and supply invoices the night before, which he had done with a level of organizational effort that Domingo would have found suspicious if he had seen it. Irene sat at the table and began looking through the ledgers with a focused attention that made the room feel different, more alive, somehow, more occupied. John stood near the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one near her elbow and kept the other to give his hand something to do. "These are not bad," she said, turning pages. "But you are recording your cattle sales and your supply costs in the same column, which makes it difficult to see at a glance whether the operation is profitable in any given season." "I know where the money comes from and where it goes," John said. "You know the general shape of it," she said, which was not precisely an argument but was clearly a correction. "With separate columns you would be able to see patterns, which months are lean, which herds yield better prices, whether your current supply prices are reasonable compared to last year." She looked up at him then, and he had the distinct and startling experience of having a very intelligent person look at him as though he were a problem she had decided to solve, which was deeply uncomfortable and also entirely captivating. "I can reorganize this," she said. "It will take a few days to sort through what you have, but once it is structured properly, keeping it current will be straightforward." "That would be very useful," he said, because it would be, which helped. She came every morning that week, arriving at 8:30 and staying until early afternoon, when she would ride back to the homestead to see to the mule and whatever small tasks the property required. John made sure there was coffee when she arrived and food available at midday, which he accomplished by ensuring that Domingo's wife, a warm and practical woman named Carmen who came in twice a week to cook and clean, happened to be at the ranch on the days Irene came. Carmen was not subtle about her opinions. By the 3rd day, she was setting 2 plates at the table at noon and calling them both to eat with the authority of a woman who has decided that something is happening, whether the participants have figured it out yet. "Your foreman's wife is very direct," Irene said on the 4th day, eating Carmen's excellent red chili with an expression of someone who has not had a truly good meal in longer than they would like to acknowledge. "She is," John agreed. "She has strong views about most things." "I like her," Irene said. "She told me this morning that your cattle are healthy and your ranch is well managed and that you work too much and do not talk enough about your feelings." John nearly choked on his coffee. "She said that. She said you are a good man who has been waiting for something and does not know what to do about it." Irene set down her fork and looked at him with the direct green eyes that had been undoing him since the day she arrived in Redrock Crossing. "I told her I was here to keep your accounts, not to speculate about your interior life." "And what did she say to that?" John asked, because he had absolutely no control over his own mouth. "She said the 2 things were not mutually exclusive," Irene said, and went back to eating her chili with a composure that he found both admirable and quietly maddening. The week became 2 weeks, and the 2 weeks became a month. The accounts took shape under Irene's careful hands. She had a natural talent for numbers and a patience for detail that turned a shoebox of receipts into something coherent and illuminating. John found himself coming in from the range earlier than necessary to find reasons to be in the house while she worked. He learned that she had grown up in a farmhouse outside Kansas City, that she had gone to a schoolhouse until she was 16, that she had taught herself ledger-keeping from a book her father had bought at a market. He learned that she had a dry, quiet sense of humor that emerged in the spaces between more serious things, like a spring that only appears in certain seasons. He learned that she took her coffee with 1 spoon of sugar, that she hummed very softly when she was deep in concentration, and that she had a habit of tapping her pen against her lower lip when a number did not add up the way she expected. He learned all of these things the way a man learns a landscape he intends to live in carefully, with full attention, storing each detail somewhere that would not be disturbed by weather or time. What he did not learn, because he did not know how to ask without revealing something he was not ready to reveal, was what she intended to do. The homestead was not viable on its own. She had no family to send for. Her wage from the ranch work was keeping her fed but not prospering, and New Mexico Territory in 1873 was not a place that made things easy for a woman alone on a piece of land with a mule and no neighbors closer than 4 miles. He did not learn it from her, but he heard it from the town, because small towns in the West carried information the way the wind carried dust everywhere, without any particular effort. He heard it from Doc Hennessy, who had attended Daniel Grady's death and had kept a quiet eye on Irene since. He heard it in the general store from the storekeeper's wife. He heard it most plainly one evening in the saloon, where he had gone for a single drink and the company of people who did not require anything of him, and where he overheard 2 men he did not particularly like discussing Irene Grady's situation with the particular comfortable cruelty of people who have no stake in the outcome. "She will have to give up the land," one of them said. "Cannot prove up on it without a man's labor, and there is no money for hired help. Probably sell what she can and move on." "Move on to where?" the other said. "That is her problem," the first one said and laughed. John set down his drink and left the saloon without finishing it, which was entirely unlike him, and rode home through the dark with the stars brilliant overhead and the desert cooling around him, and a very clear understanding forming in his mind of what needed to happen and why. He sat up half the night thinking about it, which was something he rarely did because he was a man who generally made decisions and then slept. But this decision was not a simple one, and he wanted to be sure he was examining it honestly, from all angles, without letting what he wanted color what was right. The fact was that Irene Grady was going to lose her father's land. The Homestead Act of 1862 required 5 years of continuous residence and improvement to prove up on a claim, and she had barely 8 months. She could not do the required improvement work alone, and she could not afford to hire it done. Without the land, she had no asset to sell except the mule, which would not carry her far. Without family and without money in a territory where women had limited legal standing to contract for property or credit, her options were narrow and getting narrower. He could give her more work at the ranch, more hours, more pay. He had been thinking about that already, but even that was a temporary solution to a structural problem. The world of 1873 was not built to accommodate a woman without either family or marriage, and New Mexico Territory was far less forgiving than that fact implied. The other option, the one he had been walking around very carefully all night the way you walk around a fire that gives off a great deal of warmth, was marriage. Her problem was that she needed a legal partner to help her prove up on the land, and to give her the standing that the law and the custom of the territory required. His problem was that he had a ranch that was growing, and genuinely needed a second capable person to help manage it. These 2 problems were, structurally, the same problem wearing different hats. And he was in love with her. That was the part he had to be honest with himself about, because if he was going to ask this woman to marry him for practical reasons, he owed it to himself, and to her to understand that his reasons were not purely practical and never had been. He had been in love with Irene Grady since the day she arrived in Redrock Crossing and stood in the back of her father's wagon looking at the town like she was deciding whether it was worth her time. He could not tell her that. Not yet. Not when she was in a position where she needed help, and he was the one offering it. Because a woman who needs to be saved is not a woman who can freely choose, and he was not willing to take advantage of that fact. He would ask her to marry him, and he would tell her the truth about the practical benefits, and he would say nothing about the other thing until she was on solid enough ground to say no to him, if she wanted to, and mean it without being afraid of the consequences. It was the most careful, most honest, and simultaneously most painful plan he had ever made. He rode to the homestead the next morning, earlier than usual, arriving before she had time to make the trip to his ranch. The homestead was small and weathered, a one-room cabin with a lean-to for the mule and a field that had been plowed but had not yielded anything that spring. Irene was in the yard when he arrived, throwing grain to the 3 chickens that were apparently all that remained of a larger flock her father had started. She looked up when she heard him coming, and her expression was curious because he had never come to her before. It had always been the other way around. "Mr. Rhodes," she said. "Miss Grady," he said, dismounting. He stood with the reins in his hands for a moment, which was unusual because John Rhodes was not a man who hesitated. "I need to speak with you about something." She waited, which was one of the things he valued about her. She did not fill silences with noise. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, "because I think you are the kind of person who prefers that." "I am," she said. "Your land claim cannot be proved up without a resident male partner under the current interpretation of the act in this territory," he said. "I know this because I spoke with the land office last week." He had not told her he intended to do that, but he saw from her face that she already knew the information, if not that he had gone looking for it. "Without proving up, you lose the claim. Without the claim, you have the mule, the chickens, and your current wage from my ranch, which is not enough to establish yourself anywhere new." "I know that," she said, and her voice was very steady. "I am proposing a marriage," he said. "A practical one. You would have legal standing in the territory. Your land would be maintained and improved. You would have a place in the ranch house and a share of whatever the ranch produces. My books are already in better order than they have been since I started this operation, and I would be a fool to lose that." Irene was quiet for a long moment. The chickens moved around her feet with the particular self-absorption of chickens everywhere and at all times. In the distance, a hawk was making slow circles over the bluffs. "A practical marriage," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not asking you for anything beyond what you are comfortable giving. I am asking you to consider whether it would solve both our problems." "Both our problems," she said, and there was something in the way she repeated the phrase that he could not entirely read. "You have a problem." "My operation is growing," he said. "I need a capable partner, someone who can help manage the domestic and administrative side while I manage the range work. I have been doing both, and I am not doing either as well as I should." She looked at him for a long time, and he held her gaze because he was determined that whatever else he kept from her, he was not going to look away. "You are a decent man, John Rhodes," she said finally, and the use of his first name, which she had not used before, hit him somewhere around the sternum like a gentle fist. "And I am not too proud to recognize a lifeline when it is extended. But I want to understand this clearly. You are saying this is a practical arrangement, that you are not asking for," she paused, choosing words with the care she gave to everything, "for more than partnership." "I am asking for partnership," he said, which was true and also strategic in a way he was not proud of but was not willing to abandon. What else may or may not come of it is a question for a different time when you are not standing in a yard with 3 chickens and a mule and a field that did not yield. She almost smiled at that. Almost. That is a remarkably honest framing of my situation. I was trying to be honest, he said. Give me the day, she said. I will come to the ranch tomorrow with an answer. He nodded, mounted, and rode back toward his own land, and spent the rest of that day doing the hardest kind of waiting. There is the kind where the outcome matters more than you want to admit. She came the next morning at 8:30, which was her usual time, which told him something that he tucked away carefully and did not examine too closely yet. She came in from the road and dismounted and handed the mule's reins to a ranch hand and walked up to the porch where John was standing with 2 cups of coffee, because he had been standing there for 40 minutes waiting. Yes, she said. My answer is yes. He let out a breath he had not entirely known he was holding. Good, he said. Thank you. Do not thank me, she said, taking the offered coffee cup. We are solving problems. It is a transaction. A transaction, he agreed, and handed her the coffee, and their fingers overlapped on the cup for a moment, and neither of them made anything of it, which was its own kind of making something of it. They were married 4 days later by the circuit judge who passed through Redrock Crossing on the 3rd Friday of every month. It was not a church wedding, which Irene did not seem to mind and John had not expected. Domingo and Carmen were the witnesses. Carmen brought a small bunch of wildflowers she had picked that morning, yellow desert marigolds, and the small pale blue things that grew along the creek, and pressed them into Irene's hands without comment. Irene held them through the brief ceremony with an expression that was composed and a little distant, the expression of a person executing a plan they have thought through carefully and are committed to. John said his vows in a clear voice and meant every word in ways that he was not yet entitled to share. Irene said hers in an equally clear voice, and in ways that John suspected she meant more straightforwardly than he did, which was both appropriate and quietly difficult. Afterward, Carmen made a celebratory meal of beans and rice, and roasted chicken, and a small sweet cake that she had apparently been planning since before anyone had asked her, and they ate in the main room of the ranch house with Domingo making occasional dry observations about the weather and the cattle, and carefully not making any observations about the situation, which John appreciated enormously. That evening, after the Verlas had gone home and the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, John and Irene stood in the main room of the house in the silence of 2 people who have made a significant decision and are now in the aftermath of it. The second room, John said. It is yours. I have moved some things out and put in a proper bed. It was my supply room before, but it will serve as— You do not need to explain, she said. I wanted you to be comfortable, he said. I am very practical about comfort, she said, and looked around the room with an assessing eye, the same eye she turned on ledgers and figures, and John understood that she was doing what she did with every unfamiliar thing, measuring it, understanding it, deciding how she felt about it at her own pace. Good night, Irene, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it came out quieter than he intended, softer, like something he had been saving. She looked at him for a moment. Good night, John, she said. He went to his room and lay in the dark for a long time listening to the sounds of the desert night outside his window, the coyotes calling in the distance and the wind moving through the sage, and was very careful not to think about the fact that Irene Grady, Irene Rhodes, now, was sleeping 10 feet away. The weeks that followed were a delicate kind of education. They settled into the routines of the ranch the way 2 careful people settle into a shared space, with attention and consideration, and a certain polite distance that was also, John noticed, getting gradually smaller without either of them explicitly deciding to reduce it. Irene took over the management of the house entirely, and did it with the same efficient thoroughness she had brought to the accounts, so that the ranch house was cleaner and better organized than it had been in the 4 years John had lived there, and there were actual curtains in the windows, which there had never been before, and the kitchen smell had improved from the bachelor-specific blend of coffee and dust to something that involved actual cooking. She began coming out to the range with him on Thursdays, which was his inspection day for the northern pastures, initially because she said she needed to understand the physical shape of the operation to keep the records accurately. The first time she rode out beside him through the morning light with the red bluffs rising on their left and the cattle grazing in the distance, John had to work very hard to pay attention to the cattle. "How many head do you run?" she asked. 240 right now, he said. "We will bring in more calves from the Rosals ranch in June. If the summer grass holds, we should have 280 by fall. And the price per head at the railhead? $22 to $25 in good years," he said. 18 in bad ones. She was doing the arithmetic in her head, he could tell by the slight movement of her lips. "That is a significant operation," she said. "Your margin is better than your records suggested." "The records were not well kept," he said. "No," she agreed without sharpness. "They were not, but the underlying business is sound." "I have had good help," he said, and meant it as a compliment to her, and saw from the slight shift in her expression that she had understood it that way, and that it had landed somewhere it was going to stay for a while. It was on one of those Thursday rides, about 6 weeks into the marriage, that something happened which John would think about for a long time afterward. They had ridden up to the North Ridge to check on a section of fence that one of the hands had reported as damaged, and they found not damage but a young steer that had gotten his leg caught in a gap in the wire and was thrashing badly. John dismounted and moved in carefully, talking quietly the way you do with a frightened animal, and worked to get the wire free without further injury. He did not notice until it was done that Irene had dismounted too, and had moved to the steer's head to hold it steady, kneeling in the dust without any particular concern for her dress, with her hands on the animal's neck and her voice low and continuous and calming. She had known what to do without being asked, had assessed the situation and acted, and had done it with the same lack of drama that she brought to everything. When the steer was free and had wobbled off to rejoin the herd, John looked at Irene, who was standing up and dusting off her skirt, and said, "You have done that before." "My father kept cattle for 2 years before he tried wheat," she said. "I helped him." "You grew up working," he said. "Everyone grows up working," she said, which he recognized as both true and a gentle deflection of something personal. But then she looked at him with the direct green eyes and said, "I am not fragile, John. I know you are careful with me and I appreciate it, but I am not fragile." He held her gaze. "I know that," he said. "I have known that since the feed store." Something moved across her face, quick and warm, like light moving across the floor when a cloud passes. She did not say anything else, but she nodded, and they rode back to the ranch together through the afternoon heat, and the distance between them that day felt measurably smaller than it had ever been. Domingo noticed, because Domingo noticed everything. He said nothing to John directly, but one morning while they were working on the fence line together, he said, entirely without preamble, "Your wife laughed yesterday." "In the kitchen with Carmen." "Is that remarkable?" John said. "She does not laugh much," Domingo said, "but when she does it sounds like it is a real laugh, not a polite one." He paused, which was Domingo's version of a dramatic gesture. "She is happy here. She is settling in," John said. "John," Domingo said, which was also remarkable because Domingo almost never used his name directly. "I have known you for 6 years. I know when you are settling in and when you are doing something else. I also know that she looks at you sometimes when you are not looking, and it is not the way a woman looks at an employer." John kept working on the fence. "She looks at me because she is keeping track of things," he said. "It is what she does." Domingo made a sound that was deeply skeptical of this interpretation and went back to his work. John told himself, as he had been telling himself since the beginning, that he needed to wait, that she had married him out of practical necessity, and that anything she felt now was colored by the circumstances of how they had come together, and he was not going to misread that or press it. He was going to wait until she was firmly enough established in this life that any choice she made was free of the shadow of the circumstances that had first brought her to him. But waiting is a great deal harder when the person you are waiting for is in the kitchen when you come in at night, reading by the lamp with her feet tucked up under her in the chair you have never once seen used that way before, and looks up when you come in with an expression that is so plainly, simply glad to see you that it takes everything you have not to walk directly across the room, and tell her that you have been in love with her since the day she stepped off a wagon into the dust of Redrock Crossing. It was in July that things shifted in a way that John had not anticipated. A man came to town named Garrett Foster, who was a land speculator from Santa Fe with a smooth manner and a good suit, and the particular kind of charm that announces itself loudly and means nothing. He had been buying up homestead claims across the territory from families or widows who could not prove up, paying below market value and reselling them at a profit to the cattle companies that were beginning to consolidate land in New Mexico. He came to Redrock Crossing because the land office in Santa Fe had records of unclaimed or struggling homesteads in the area, and among those records, John learned this from the clerk at the local land office, a nervous young man named Percy Holt, who told John because he liked Irene, and because he was constitutionally incapable of keeping information to himself, was the Grady claim. Or rather, the claim was now in both their names, John and Irene Rhodes, because the marriage had been recorded and the land transfer had been filed. But Foster apparently had not caught up with that change, because he came to the ranch one afternoon while John was out checking cattle with a perfectly friendly knock at the front door. Irene answered it, which she would not have been expected to do in any scenario that Foster had apparently planned for. John came back 2 hours later to find Irene at the kitchen table with the land deed papers spread out before her, and an expression on her face that he could not immediately classify. He was about to ask when she looked up. "A man named Foster came today," she said. "He wanted to buy the homestead." "I know who Foster is," John said, moving to the table. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the property was not for sale," she said. "He was very polite about it and suggested that the claim might be difficult to maintain and that he could offer a fair price that would give us options. And I told him again that the property was not for sale and that he was welcome to check the current deed at the land office, which would clarify that it was no longer a struggling claim." She paused. "He was less polite after that." John looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said. He was not threatening, just persistent and then sulky. She looked down at the papers. "He reminded me that before our marriage I would have had no legal standing to refuse him at all. That as a single woman I could not hold a claim alone for long, and the territory would have eventually allowed it to lapse." She was quiet for a moment. "He said this as though he expected it to be news to me." "It was not news to you," John said. "No," she said. "It was not." She looked up at him, and there was something in her expression that was different from what he usually saw there. It was rawer, more open, like something she had been keeping in careful order had been slightly disturbed. "John, you knew before you proposed that this was going to happen. That men like Foster were going to come, that without you I would have lost everything within the year." "I knew it was likely," he said. "Yes. So you proposed to protect me," she said. He held her gaze with the same honesty he had always tried to hold it. "I proposed because it was the right thing to do," he said, "and because I needed a capable partner and because the two things aligned." "The two things aligned," she said, and the slight emphasis she put on it was not quite irony but was in the neighborhood of it. "Irene," he said, and then stopped himself. "What?" she said. He looked at her for a long time. The lamp was lit because the afternoon had gotten overcast, and it threw warm light across the table and across her face, and he was aware of every detail of her the way he was always aware of every detail of her, which was something he had long since stopped arguing with himself about. "I am glad you are here," he said. "That is all I am going to say about it." She looked at him for another long moment, and then something in her face did what it had done on the North Ridge, that warm, fast thing, like light across a floor, and she gathered the papers into a neat stack and said, I will make certain Foster has no further grounds to approach us. I am going to ride to the land office tomorrow and speak with Percy Holt about registering the improvements we have made. I will come with you, he said. You do not need to, she said. I know that, he said. I would like to. She looked at him again with the assessing, measuring look, and then she nodded. All right, she said. Then come. They rode to town together the next morning, and the sight of them riding in side by side, which Redrock Crossing's inhabitants absorbed through their windows, and their porch chairs with the avid interest of a community that had been watching this situation develop since the day Irene first came into Bert Calloway's feed store, was apparently satisfying to a great many people. Carmen Verla heard about it secondhand and told Domingo, who did not say anything but smiled into his coffee cup in a way that was deeply self-satisfied. Percy Holt at the land office was visibly relieved to see John and Irene together, and he registered the improvement documentation with the kind of efficient enthusiasm of a man who has been personally invested in the outcome. They walked out of the land office into the main street of Redrock Crossing, and Irene stopped and looked up and down the street with the same expression she had worn the day she arrived, that assessing look, half judgment and half wonder. This town is small, she said. It is, John agreed. But it is not without its uses, she said. No, he said. I think I might like it here, she said, and it was such an enormous thing for her to say, given everything, that John had to look away for a moment and pretend to examine the hardware store window with great interest. I think it might like you back, he said, which came out more sincere than smooth, which was, he supposed, typical. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, John. Yes, he said. How long have you known me, she said. He turned back to look at her. 8 months before we married, he said. We have been married 2 months. 10 months, she said. Yes, he said. In 10 months, she said carefully, have you ever told me anything that was not true? No, he said. Have you ever left out anything important? She said. He was very still. The street of Redrock Crossing went on around them, a wagon passing, a dog crossing in the distance, someone hammering something in the direction of the carpenter's shop. All the ordinary machinery of a small western town continuing as it always did. Yes, he said. She looked at him steadily. Will you tell me, she said. He had been planning to wait. He had been planning to wait until she was thoroughly settled, until there was no question of the old circumstances casting a shadow, until she could choose freely, and without any debt of gratitude or necessity coloring the choosing. He had planned this carefully over many nights, with the kind of deliberate patience that was one of his better qualities. And here she was, standing in the street of Redrock Crossing, asking him directly, with those green eyes that had never once failed to see more than he intended. And he understood that the patience was going to have to give way to the honesty, because he was constitutionally incapable of looking her in the face and doing anything less than telling her the truth. I have been in love with you, he said, since the day you arrived, the first day. You were standing in the back of your father's wagon looking at this town, and you looked like the most real person I had ever seen, and I did not know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything with it for almost a year. Irene was very still. When I found you in the feed store, he said, and offered you the accounting work, the work was genuine. I did need it done. But the reason I spoke up at all was that I could not watch you walk out of that store without doing something. And when I proposed, I told you the truth about the practical reasons. Everything I said was true. I did not lie to you. But I left out that the entire practical arrangement was also the only thing I could think of that would let me give you what you needed without making you feel like you owed me something you hadn't chosen to give. He stopped. The street was very bright. I am telling you now, he said, because you asked and because I am not capable of lying to you. Not about this, not about anything. Irene was quiet for a very long time. Long enough that the dog he had seen crossing the street in the distance had presumably reached whatever destination it had in mind and started something else entirely. Carmen told me, she said finally. What? He said. Carmen told me, 3 weeks ago. She paused. She said she had waited long enough and that someone had to tell me because you clearly were not going to. He stared at her. What exactly did she tell you? That you had asked about me. Before I ever came into the feed store, that you had asked the postmaster my name. She said this with an expression that was doing complicated things, multiple things at once, which he was only beginning to have the vocabulary to read. She said you built the second room's bed yourself, the night after I said yes, because the one that was in there was not good enough. He had done that. He had not told anyone he was doing it. Domingo had apparently told Carmen, because Domingo always told Carmen, because they were married people who told each other things, and that, John reflected, was the thing that happened when you lived in close proximity to people who knew you. Irene, he said. I married you, she said, because you solved my immediate problem and because you were decent, and because I had my father's land to think about. That part is entirely true, and I am not going to pretend it was not part of the reason. I know, he said. But, she said, and the word came out with a particular weight, the kind of word that has been waiting a long time to be said. The other part is that I have been paying attention to you for 10 months, John Rhodes, and everything I have seen has been someone I want to know better. Someone whose steadiness I trust. Someone who built a bed the night after I said yes because he wanted me to be comfortable, and then said nothing about it. He could not quite speak. I am not free of the circumstances that brought us here, she said. I am aware of that. But I am also not stupid, and I am not easily moved, and I would not be standing in this street telling you this if I did not mean it. She took a breath, and it was the first small uncertainty he had ever seen from her, and it was somehow more affecting than anything else she had said. I think I have been falling in love with you for several weeks now, perhaps longer. I have been trying to determine whether it was gratitude or something else, and it is something else. John Rhodes, who was a man of measured words and careful silences, took 2 steps forward in the main street of Redrock Crossing, New Mexico territory, and took Irene Rhodes's hands in both of his, and said nothing at all for a moment because there was nothing more useful than what she had already said. Something else, he said finally. Something considerably more than gratitude, she said, and there was the dry, quiet humor underneath it, the spring that only appeared in certain seasons, and he found it so entirely wonderful that he laughed, which he did not do often, and she looked startled for a moment. And then she smiled, a real smile, not a composed one, not the careful, controlled expression he was used to, and it transformed her face into something so luminous that he was briefly incapable of any structured thought. I would like to start over, he said, or not start over exactly, continue, but with this said. Agreed, she said. They rode home together through the dust and the sage and the afternoon light, and when they arrived, Irene went inside and made coffee, and John went to thank Domingo for absolutely nothing specific, but with a warmth that Domingo understood perfectly. And Carmen, who had been at the ranch that day helping with the laundry, came to the door of the house and looked at Irene with the triumphant satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something for a very long time. Finally, Carmen said. You told him that you told me, Irene said. I told him nothing, Carmen said, with a dignity that was mostly genuine. I may have allowed him to figure some things out. Carmen, Irene said. You are welcome, Carmen said, and went back to the laundry. What followed was the summer that John Rhodes would remember for the rest of his life as the time when everything that had been carefully held at a distance became, instead, something held close, and it was better than anything the careful distance had allowed him to imagine. He courted his own wife with a sincere thoroughness that amused Domingo and charmed Carmen, and mystified the ranch hands, who were accustomed to a boss who was focused and efficient, and not generally prone to bringing wildflowers in from the range and leaving them on the kitchen windowsill. He learned the details he had not learned in the months before, that she read voraciously, and had brought a small stack of books from Missouri that she had been working through and rereading since her arrival, that she could ride better than anyone else on the ranch, including John, though she had never mentioned it, that she had opinions about cattle breeding that were based on a careful reading of the limited literature available and were largely correct, that she cried once, quietly, on a Tuesday evening in August, because it was her father's birthday, and when John sat beside her at the table and said nothing because there was nothing to say, she eventually leaned her head against his shoulder with a naturalness that made him think that they had been a long time coming to this particular moment. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in late August, which was appropriate because Thursday was their day, the inspection rides, the North Ridge, the beginning of everything that had become this. They had been sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sky go dark over the bluffs, which did this business in New Mexico with a particular drama. The red rock going rose and then purple and then a deep, final blue, and Irene had been saying something about the account books and he had been listening. And at some point her words had slowed and she had looked at him with that particular expression that had been getting more frequent and more readable as the summer went on. And he had done what he had wanted to do for the better part of a year, which was to close the remaining distance between them. It was a gentle kiss, careful and deliberate, and full of the particular warmth of something that has been waited for long enough that it arrives with its whole weight. And Irene made a small sound against his mouth that might have been surprise and might have been relief and was almost certainly both. And then she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to every other thing she committed to. And John thought, with the specific clarity of a man whose most carefully held hope has just become real, that he would not have changed a single thing about the long, slow road that had brought them here. The territory moved around them in the way territories do, with change, with difficulty, with occasional injustice that demanded acknowledgement. John was not unaware that the land he worked, the land they were now building a life on together, sat on ground that had belonged to Apache and Pueblo peoples for centuries before the American government began its aggressive expansion into the Southwest. He had known Apache people and respected them, had traded fairly with them when trade was possible, and kept his fences where his fences were supposed to be. He held no illusions about the justice of the larger history, even as he lived within it, and it was a conversation he and Irene had one evening in September. She had noticed the historical records in the land office, the older maps, the careful erasures of what had been there before, and she asked him what he thought about it, and he told her honestly. "It was not done rightly," he said. "I did not do it personally, but I live on the result of it, and I think a man should know that about the land he works, should know it and be honest about it and not pretend it was other than it was." Irene was quiet for a moment. "My father believed he was building something," she said. "He believed in the idea of new land and new starts, but I have been thinking about whose starts they were new for and whose were ending." She looked at him. "I think you are right that honesty is what is owed." They did not and could not resolve what generations of policy and violence had made, but they held it in their consciousness and in their conversation, which was more than many of their contemporaries chose to do, and it was part of what made them, John thought, genuinely suited to each other. This shared insistence on looking at things as they were rather than as it was comfortable to pretend them to be. The fall of 1873 came in over the bluffs with a gentleness that New Mexico falls sometimes have, the days warm and the nights cool, and the light hitting the red rock at a low angle that made everything look like it was illuminated from inside. They worked together on the cattle operation with a natural complementarity that Domingo declared, in his measured way, to be the most efficient thing he had seen on this ranch since John had hired him. Irene had begun going to town on Thursdays, a different Thursday errand than the range inspections, which were still theirs and always would be, to help an older woman, Mrs. Pearson, whose husband had died in the spring and who was managing alone with two grown sons who were not much practical help. She taught Mrs. Pearson's youngest son to read, which she did quietly and without making an announcement of it, and John found out through Carmen, who found out through the network of Redrock Crossing women that transmitted information with a speed and accuracy that the telegraph might have envied. "You could have told me," he said. "It did not seem like a thing that needed telling," she said, which he recognized as the way she said that it was personal and important, and she was not yet sure how much of the important things she could let him see without becoming somehow vulnerable in a way she was still getting used to. "Irene," he said. "Yes," she said. "You can tell me the personal things," he said. "The important personal things. I will not do anything foolish with them." She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "I know that. I am practicing." "Practicing," he said. "Being the kind of person who tells someone the important things," she said. "I have not had much occasion for it." He understood deeply and completely what she was saying, and he was careful with it. "I have not had much occasion for it either," he said. "We can practice together." That seemed to settle something for her, because she smiled the real smile, the luminous one, and said, "I taught Tommy Pearson to read because he is 8 years old and his father died before he could finish the job and someone needed to finish it." "That is a good reason," John said. "I like doing it," she added more quietly. "I think I would like to do more of it, teach, if there were a way." John turned that thought over carefully. There was a school in Redrock Crossing, of a kind, a one-room arrangement that functioned approximately 9 months a year, and had been without a consistent teacher since the previous year's teacher had left to marry a rancher in Colorado. The town had been discussing what to do about it in the unfocused, circular way that small towns discuss problems they don't have the money or organization to solve. "I think," John said, "that we should speak with the town council." "About what?" she said. "About the school," he said. She looked at him in a way that was extremely direct and also, he thought, slightly undone, which was the expression she got when something happened that she had not fully let herself expect. "John," she said, "you are good at it," he said. "You clearly enjoy it. The town needs it. These 3 facts seem connected." She was quiet for a moment. "It would require time away from the ranch accounts." "The accounts are in excellent shape," he said. "And I have learned enough from you that I can maintain them in a basic way. You could still oversee them." "You have it all worked out," she said, and there was the dry humor again, the undercurrent of warmth beneath it. "I have been thinking about it for approximately 3 weeks," he said, "since Carmen told me about Tommy Pearson." "Carmen," she said. "Carmen," he agreed. The town council agreed to pay a small stipend, modest, in the honest tradition of New Mexico territorial towns, which were perpetually short of funds. And Irene became the teacher at the Redrock Crossing schoolhouse, which she commenced in October of 1873, with 14 students ranging from 6 to 13 years of age, who arrived on the first morning with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and all of them, by the end of the week, showing up voluntarily before the official start time, because the new teacher told stories. John rode with her to school on those mornings, most of them. Not because she needed him to, she was abundantly capable of riding 4 miles to town on her own, as she pointed out on the first morning with the kind of fond exasperation that had become his favorite of her tones, but because he liked the early morning ride, and liked the conversation, and liked the way she talked about the students with an attention to each particular child that he found very moving. "Henry Calloway," she said one morning, which made John blink because Henry was Bert Calloway's son, and there was a particular texture to that. "He is quicker than he knows. He becomes embarrassed when he gets something right because he is used to expecting that he won't. I need to find a way to let him succeed without making a fuss about it." "That is a delicate business," John said. "Most good things are," she said. He looked at her in the morning light and loved her with the full, settled weight of a feeling that had been tested and proved over the course of nearly a year, and she caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You are remarkable." She looked forward at the road, but she was smiling the real smile, the one that was only for moments that couldn't be played down. "You say that too much," she said. "I mean it every time," he said. "I know," she said, and it was said in a way that meant she was glad of it, which was more than enough. Winter came gently to Redrock Crossing that year and wrapped the bluffs in a low, pale light and sent the temperature down enough at night that the fire in the ranch house became necessary and welcome. John and Irene had long since stopped observing any remaining formality in the structure of their marriage, which had become, in the way of good marriages everywhere, simply their life. The work and the evenings and the early mornings and the long Thursday rides and the school days and the weekends when Carmen came, and the three of them made too much food and ate it with the Verlas and talked late into the evening. There was a night in November when a storm came down from the mountains, the kind of winter storm that New Mexico occasionally produces with no warning and total commitment, driving snow sideways across the plain and rattling the windows of the ranch house with a determined persistence. They had been home well before it arrived, and the fire was high and the larder was full. And after supper Irene had brought out one of her Missouri books and was reading by the fire while John was at the table working on the account books. He had been keeping them, true to his word, in the manner she had taught him, with the separate columns and the seasonal comparisons. He looked up at some point and she was watching him instead of reading, with the book open in her lap and her feet tucked under her, and an expression on her face that was the most open he had ever seen it. Not the composed professional expression, not the careful measuring look, not even the luminous smile, but something quieter and deeper than all of those, a steadiness that matched his own. "I am glad," she said when she saw him notice, "that you spoke to me in the feed store." "I was afraid you would refuse the work," he said. "I almost did," she said. "I was not certain about the charity." "It was not charity," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I knew it then a little." To say yes, she looked into the fire for a moment. "I was very frightened, you know, after my father died. I did not show it because showing fear felt like giving something away, but I was very frightened." "I know," he said quietly. "You did not let it show on your face," she said. "When you were kind to me, you were not pitying about it, that mattered." She looked back at him. "You treated me like a capable person who had a problem to solve, not like a helpless woman who needed rescuing." "You are a capable person who had a problem to solve," he said. "Most people would not have seen the distinction," she said. He got up from the table and crossed to the fire and sat beside her in the way they had settled into on winter evenings, close enough to share the warmth and the quiet. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which had started as an occasional thing and was now simply the arrangement, the natural geography of an evening. "I would like to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I love you," she said, which she had not said before in that direct, plain form. It had been present in many things she said and did, but not in those words, and the words, when they came, were so entirely characteristic of her straightforward, no ceremony, just the truth delivered with complete conviction, that he found himself slightly breathless. "Irene," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I have known that you know for some time, but I wanted to say it plainly." "I love you," he said, just as plainly, which was easy because he had been saying it to himself for the better part of a year, and saying it to her felt like a door finally opened to a room you had stood outside of for a very long time. "I have loved you for longer than I can entirely justify." "Since the wagon," she said. "Since the wagon," he agreed. "That is slightly unreasonable," she said, but she was smiling against his shoulder. "I am aware of that," he said. "But not entirely surprising," she added, and he laughed, and she laughed too, and the fire crackled in the storm, and the ranch house held them warm and solid and entirely their own. The winter passed into a spring that was kinder than the previous one, with rain that came in March in reasonable amounts and grass that came up green and thick in the northern pastures, and a calf crop that was the best John had seen in 4 years of running this operation. Irene managed the school through its first full year, with a competence that the town of Redrock Crossing acknowledged by renewing her appointment without discussion and raising the stipend by $5 a month, which was apparently the town council's version of high praise. It was in April of 1874 that Irene told John she was expecting, which she did in the morning, at the kitchen table, over coffee, in the same direct and unfussy way she did everything significant. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said, and watched him with the expression she always had when she told him something important, that slight, beautiful vulnerability underneath the composure. John set down his coffee cup with a care that was the only outward sign of the very large feeling that was happening inside him. "When," he said. "October, I think," she said. "I will ask Doc Hennessy to confirm." "October," he said. He looked at her across the table in the morning light, and she looked back at him, and they were quiet for a moment with the full weight of this new thing settling between them like something that was going to be there from now on and change the dimensions of everything. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but well." "Good," he said. Then, because he was constitutionally honest, and because she deserved to know exactly what she was looking at, "I am extremely glad," he said, "in case that was not clear from my face." "Your face is never entirely clear," she said, "but this particular occasion you are legible." He got up from the table and came around to her, and took her face in his hands the way he had learned that she liked, carefully, with the full weight of his attention, and kissed her forehead, which was not how he usually kissed her but which felt correct for this specific morning. She put her hands over his and held them there for a moment, and the kitchen was very quiet and very warm and full of the particular feeling of something large and good beginning. Doc Hennessy confirmed the expectation in late April and offered the usual advice about rest and food, which Irene listened to politely, and then continued doing exactly what she had been doing, because she was constitutionally unsuited to idleness. She continued teaching through June, when the school broke for summer, and ran the ranch accounts and rode the Thursday inspections at a slightly more leisurely pace, and told John when she was tired and needed help, which was a significant development given how long it had taken her to practice telling him the important things. Carmen Verla responded to the news with the absolute conviction of a woman who has been waiting for this particular development to occur and considers it long overdue, and immediately began consulting Irene on the subject of childbirth, with the authority of a woman who had navigated this territory 3 times herself. Domingo shook John's hand with a firmness that communicated considerably more than congratulation, and the 3 ranch hands, who were young men ranging from 19 to 25, and deeply invested in the romantic history of their employers, reacted with a wholehearted enthusiasm that was entirely endearing. The summer moved warm and full through June and July and into August. John and Irene added to the homestead what had been Irene's father's land. It was now formally part of the Rhodes ranch operation, the proved-up claim finally filed and recorded, a small victory over the circumstances that had almost taken it, and began planning an extension to the ranch house that would eventually include a second proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. The construction was slow but satisfying, done mostly on weekends with help from Domingo and 2 of the hands, and Irene oversaw the planning of it with an attention to how a house should actually function, based on years of living in houses that had not particularly accounted for the preferences of the people inside them. In September, a letter arrived from Irene's mother's sister, an aunt she had not seen since childhood, who had somehow obtained a copy of the marriage announcement that Percy Holt had submitted to the territorial newspaper. Percy apparently felt that good news deserved wide circulation, and who wrote in a cramped and affectionate hand to say that she had not known Irene was in New Mexico and was very glad she was not alone, and that she hoped Mr. Rhodes was a good man. Irene showed John the letter at supper one evening with an expression he could not immediately read. "Your aunt," he said. "My father's sister married and moved east when I was 12, she said. I have not heard from her in many years. I did not think she would." She stopped. "I did not think there was anyone who would be glad about me, besides you." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did easily now, the ease of a man who has been given permission and uses it with care. "Write back to her," he said. "I will," she said. "I want her to know about the baby." "Tell her to come," he said, "if she can manage the journey." She looked at him with the particular expression she had when he did something that she had not allowed herself to expect. "She would have to travel from Virginia," she said. "I know," he said. "That is a significant invitation from a man who has never met her," she said. "She is your family," he said simply. "That is sufficient." Irene wrote the letter, and the aunt, a woman named Margaret Aldis who turned out to be small and capable and entirely unlike Daniel Grady's helpless optimism, arrived in Redrock Crossing in late September with a trunk full of useful things and an immediate and thorough approval of John Rhodes that she expressed, in the direct family manner, within approximately 15 minutes of meeting him. "He looks at you properly," she said to Irene while John was unloading her trunk from the stage. "What does that mean?" Irene said. "Like you are the particular person he has been looking for," Margaret said. "Not like you are a possession or a convenience. Like you are a person. It is not as common as it should be." Irene looked at John across the yard, lifting her aunt's trunk with the easy strength of a man accustomed to heavy work, and thought about a day in the feed store in Redrock Crossing when she had been holding a single silver dollar and trying to decide whether to be afraid, and a man in the back of the store had looked at her and offered work and had said both and had meant it. "No," she said, "it is not." The baby arrived on the 14th of October, 1874, in the middle of the night, delivered by Doc Hennessy with Carmen Verla's capable assistance, and John pacing the outer room in a state of controlled anxiety that he was not managing quite as well as usual. Margaret sat with him for part of it and said very little, which he appreciated. When Doc Hennessy came out and said, "Healthy boy, strong lungs, and your wife is doing fine," John stood up and was very still for a moment and then sat back down because his legs had apparently decided to mark the occasion in their own way. "Go see her," Margaret said. He went in and Irene was there, tired and flushed and entirely herself, with a small, red-faced, loudly opinionated person in her arms, and she looked up at John with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen on her face. All the composure set down, all the careful measuring at rest, nothing there but the full, plain truth of what she felt, which was enormous. "Come see him," she said. John sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son, who was small and loud, and apparently had strong opinions about the entire situation of having arrived. He looked at Irene's face and she looked at his, and the ranch house held them in the October dark with the sound of the desert outside and the fire low in the next room. "What shall we call him?" she asked. "You should choose," he said. "Daniel," she said, which he had expected and which moved him more than he expected, and his voice when he said it back was not entirely steady. "Daniel Rhodes," he said. "That is a good name." "After my father," she said, "who was not a particularly practical man but who brought me here, which led to you." She looked down at the baby and then back up. "So he was, in the end, practical in the only way that mattered." John kissed her hair very gently, because she was tired and the moment was large enough to treat with care. "In the only way that mattered," he agreed. Daniel Rhodes was a loud, healthy, deeply opinionated infant who grew into an equally loud and opinionated toddler, and the ranch adjusted around him with the flexibility of an operation run by capable people who were good at dealing with unexpected developments. Margaret stayed for 6 months and then returned to Virginia with the promise of returning the following summer, having decided that Irene was well situated and that John Rhodes was, as she reported to various Virginia relatives, a man of unusual quality who had the sense to appreciate what he had. The school in Redrock Crossing continued under Irene's care with an enrollment that grew as the town grew, because New Mexico Territory in the mid-1870s was in a period of gradual, unsteady expansion. More families arriving, more permanent settlement, the beginning of what would eventually become a more complex and complicated society. Irene taught reading and arithmetic and history, and writing with the full conviction of a person who believed that knowledge was the most democratizing force available. And she taught the children of Mexican families and Anglo families, and the occasional child of a mixed-race family with the same attention and expectation she brought to all of them, which was not entirely uncontroversial in a territory with its particular history and its particular tensions, but which Irene considered non-negotiable, and said so clearly enough that the controversy generally resolved itself relatively quickly. John rode the range and managed the operation and expanded it carefully, not dramatically, not with the land-grabbing fever that had taken some of his neighbors, but steadily, adding pasture when it was available at a fair price, and never overextending the cattle numbers past what the land could sustain. He was, in Domingo's assessment, the best kind of rancher, the kind who understood that the land was not inexhaustible and treated it accordingly. In 1876, Irene told him there would be a second child, which she announced in the same kitchen, at the same table, in the same direct and unfussy way as the first, and John received this news with considerably less leg failure than the first time, though the enormous feeling was entirely unchanged in scale. "Are you well?" he asked, same as before. "Very well," she said, same as before, with a small smile that acknowledged they were repeating themselves and that neither of them minded. This baby arrived in August in the heat of the summer and was a girl, a serious, quiet-eyed infant who regarded the world from her first moments with an expression so similar to her mother's assessing look that John started laughing when Doc Hennessy put her in his arms because he recognized her. "What?" Irene said from the bed. "She looks at things like you do," he said, "like she is deciding whether they are worth her time." "I do not look like that," Irene said. "You very much do," he said. "It is one of the first things I noticed about you. You were paying a great deal of attention to how I looked," she said. "I was," he said, without apology. Irene shook her head, but she was smiling. "What shall we call her?" she said, and this time it was his turn. "My mother's name was Clara," he said. "Clara," Irene tried it. "Clara Rhodes." She looked at the baby. "Yes," she said, "that is her." The years that followed were the years of the life they built, which was neither a storybook life nor a hard one, but a real one full of difficulty and humor and work and love in the proportions that real lives have, and beautiful in the way real lives can be when the right people are in them. Redrock Crossing grew as the territory grew, and the small schoolhouse was replaced by a larger one in 1878, and Irene was named its head teacher with a salary that was still modest by any fair accounting, but represented the town's genuine appreciation. John's operation expanded to include a small horse breeding program that Domingo managed with considerable expertise, and that turned out to be surprisingly profitable. And the ranch house acquired its second bedroom and larger kitchen, and eventually a covered porch that ran the full front length of the house, where they sat on summer evenings and watched Daniel chase lizards across the yard, and Clara sat beside her mother very seriously learning to read. Garrett Foster came back to Redrock Crossing in 1877, though he had no particular business there, and seemed to have prospered in the intervening years, and was less inclined toward the land speculation that had made him unpopular. He came into the general store on a Tuesday when Irene was there getting supplies, and was civil to her in a way that acknowledged, without explicitly stating, that the situation she was in now was considerably different from the one he had attempted to exploit 4 years before. She was civil back with the kind of composure that made no concession at all to the memory of being vulnerable, and that was that. Some injustices are too large to be resolved by individual acts of personal virtue. The displacement of the Apache and Pueblo peoples from their lands was happening all around them, driven by federal policy and territorial politics and the relentless pressure of expansion. And John and Irene both knew this and felt it and said so to each other, and to their children as those children grew old enough to understand history. They were not powerful enough to stop it and honest enough not to pretend they could, but they refused to participate in the worst of it, and they made sure that their children understood what had been given up by others so that they could be where they were. It was not enough by any fair measure, but it was what honesty and conscience required, and they did not shrink from it. Daniel Rhodes at 4 was loud and fearless and very fond of Domingo, who taught him to ride a horse at an age that made Doc Hennessy raise his eyebrows and Irene cover her eyes. Clara was quiet and absorbed and read everything in the house by the time she was 5, which led to a steady and somewhat expensive supply of new books, sourced by mail order from a bookseller in Santa Fe. In 1879, Irene told John there would be a third child, and this one arrived in February of 1880 and was another boy, whom they named Thomas after Irene's father's father, and who arrived with red hair that apparently came from somewhere in the family history that no one could immediately identify, and who was from the beginning the most peaceful and contented of the 3 children, which was either a gift or a reflection of the fact that by the third child, 2 experienced parents simply radiated less anxiety. The school needed a second teacher by 1880, as the enrollment had grown past 30 students, and Irene hired a young woman from Albuquerque named Frances Webb, who was sensible and warm and learned quickly. And the 2 of them ran the Redrock Crossing School together with a partnership that had its own complementarity. Frances was effusive and demonstrative, where Irene was precise and contained, and the children benefited from both. On the evening of their 7th anniversary, the 3rd Friday of May in 1880, because it had been a 3rd Friday in May when the circuit judge had married them in a quick ceremony with Carmen's wildflowers, John came in from the range in the early afternoon, which he never did, and found Irene at the kitchen table going through correspondence from the school board. She looked up. "You are early," she said. "I am," he said. He went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table and sat down, and she waited, because she still knew how to wait for what was coming. 7 years, he said. 7 years, she agreed. "I have been thinking about what you said," he said, "about not telling me the important things." She raised her eyebrows slightly because this was old territory, resolved territory. "You told me you were practicing," he said, "at the beginning, being the kind of person who tells someone the important things." "I remember," she said. "I think you have become very good at it," he said. "I think you are the best person I know at it, actually, better than me." She looked at him steadily, with the green eyes that had never stopped being the first thing he saw when he walked into any room. "What are you trying to tell me?" she said, with the dry humor that meant she already knew. "That I would do it all again," he said. "The feed store, the practical arrangement, all of it. I would do every bit of it again. Even the part where you loved me in secret for a year," she said. "Even that," he said, "although I would have told you sooner if I had been braver." "You were brave enough at exactly the right moment," she said. "Carmen was braver," he said. "Carmen is always braver," she agreed, and smiled the real smile, the one that had never stopped undoing him, not in 7 years, not in all the ordinary days and difficult ones and extraordinary ones that 7 years of a real life contains. He took her hand across the table, in the kitchen of the house they had built together, with the sound of Daniel shouting at something in the yard, and Clara reading somewhere in the interior of the house, and Thomas sleeping in the peaceful way he always slept, and the desert light coming through the window at the low afternoon angle that turned everything warm and red and particular. "I love you," he said. It was still easy to say after 7 years. It had only gotten easier. "I love you," she said, which she had gotten very good at saying in the plain, direct way she did everything that mattered, since considerably earlier than I admitted. "How early?" he said. "The North Ridge," she said. "When you were untangling the steer and you looked up and saw me there and you said, you have done that before," in that voice you use when something surprises you. "That was 2 months into the marriage," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm a slow and thorough person." "You are the most thorough person I have ever known," he said. "Is that a complaint?" she said. "It is the furthest possible thing from a complaint," he said. Outside, Daniel's shouting resolved itself into the sound of a boy falling down and getting up again immediately, which was how he handled most things. And Clara's voice from the interior offered a quiet comment that was probably about whatever she was reading. And Thomas slept on, peaceful in the winter-end light, and Redrock Crossing went on outside their window with all the ordinary business of a small New Mexico town, continuing its stubborn, beautiful, difficult, imperfect, real life. John Rhodes held his wife's hand across the kitchen table of a house he had largely built himself, on land that was now theirs in the full and lawful sense, in a life that was nothing like a plan and everything like what he had known it could be. From a morning years ago when a woman had stood in the back of a wagon and looked at a town with the most assessing, extraordinary, alive expression he had ever seen on a human face, and he had known recklessly, unreasonably, completely, that she mattered. He had been right, she had mattered more than anything. And she was here, and she was his, and he was hers, and the life they had made was standing, solid and warm and fully itself, in the last light of a May afternoon in New Mexico territory. And there was nothing unresolved, nothing left out, nothing held back, only this, only them. Only the particular beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary fact of a thing that had begun with one careful word in the back of a feed store and had become, year by year and day by day, and in all the specific irreplaceable details of a life chosen, and built and deeply, thoroughly loved, everything.